Welcome to the Triage Method podcast with me, Gary McGowan, and my co-host, Paddy Farrell. How are you this week, Paddy?
I am absolutely fantastic, Gary. It's actually freezing where I am currently. It was freezing all day. I hope it was much warmer down in the sunny South Cork area.
Absolutely roasting, as always. As you can see, if you're watching this on YouTube, I'm in the tropical paradise of Douglas, Cork.
Anyway, right, Gary. So in the last episode, we introduced the topic of obesity, and this is where we're going with the next few episodes of the podcast. Because, again, like as we said in the last episode, people have a very simplified view of the obesity epidemic, and thus people have very simplified views as to the solution for the obesity epidemic. And like, this is not to say that people aren't coming from a good place, because ultimately, if you listen to the last episode, we came to basically the same solution as individuals for ourselves. Like the solution we can give, it basically comes down to finding a way to exercise and finding a way to manage your nutrition, and it's like, that's not a great messaging overall in terms of what we can provide people. But unfortunately, we're not policymakers. Well, actually, fortunately for our health, we're not policymakers. So that's like, there's not a huge amount that we can do on that front, right? However, I do want to enlighten, hopefully, people in terms of the various aspects that do go into this whole epidemic, this obesity epidemic, which again we discussed in the last episode. And there's quite a lot that we can further introduce in this episode, but I would say go back and listen to that previous episode, because we gave a little bit of an example at the end of it, obviously an introduction to the topic and then an example at the end of it. And as we said, like, hopefully it is apparent that those two situations, they're not the same situations in terms of, we'll call it, their risk for obesity or their ability to handle obesity if they do find themselves in an obese state. So the causes of obesity, before we get into that, Gary, do you have anything else to add to that? Because you are part of the podcast, I'll allow it.
No, I'm here to discuss the causes of obesity. Let's go.
Right. So there's obviously, this is multifactorial, and realistically, we're not going to cover every single cause here, but I want to introduce, we'll call them like 6 broader categories that you can kind of conceptualize this stuff and kind of think about this stuff in terms of the causes of obesity. And the first one is education around nutrition, right? And I don't mean just in terms of, oh, people just don't know what to eat, right? Because like, most people do know what to eat. That's most people do. Most people are like, I know fruits and vegetables are good for me. You might be fuzzy on the specifics in terms of, how much protein I should have or how much of this I should have. But most people, if you ask them, like, what are good foods, they'd be able to point out good foods, right? And now, obviously, we would be advocating for, better information in whatever aspect that is, in terms of nutrition, increasing your nutritional IQ, we'll call it, or nutritional knowledge. Like, it always is a good thing, right? However, there's some things within this that really do fall into the topic of education and the obesity epidemic in terms of the progression of this situation that we find ourselves in. And the first one is the media representation of nutrition, right? It's effectively bad science communication. Would you agree with that, Gary?
I think so.
You have anything to add to that?
That education the education has been poor. I would say, like, yeah, like, to be honest, like, I think I'm a pessimist on this topic in general, like, which is why I don't get very excited as you bring it up, because, like, I think that education is fairly futile. Like, I like to think myself personally, I think that education is quite powerful, and I think that education is a positive thing. And I think that as you start from childhood and you bring health education into schools, and I think that it's great. It sounds like a fantastic thing, and I think overall, promoting health literacy especially as it relates to things like nutrition, for example, is very much a positive thing. However, I don't think that a large proportion of obesity prevalence would be modified by people having better knowledge of nutrition as such. But I do think it's definitely a part of the puzzle, and I think that there's something to be said here for the difference between centralized education and decentralized education, because I think this is where a lot of confusion actually arises, because what people will say are things like, oh, we're always so confused because one minute they are telling us to eat this and then the next minute they are telling us to eat this, and it's constantly changing. Whereas if you actually look at like nutrition guidelines and nutrition recommendations and the consensus of most researchers for decades, not much has changed at all in terms of what is actually recommended as being mostly healthy foods, and foods to be avoided in excess.
And
And I
this is
think that
especially true on the calories in, calories out side of things. Like we've definitely refined our knowledge
exactly,
over the last while, but like they've known that for 200 years, more than that. Like people literally knew it, maybe not the actual caloric stuff, but they were like, if you eat more, you gain weight. If you eat less, you lose weight. Like they knew that.
exactly. And I think this is where kind of confusion arises, is because particularly in the age of where people get more and more information from social media, they feel like the messages are changing more than they actually are. And that also goes for popular media like newspapers, particularly newspapers that rely on shock headlines and new messages, etc. There's kind of always a release of something new. Like you'll see things like, oh, a study just finds that eggs increase rates of diabetes by 300% or something along those lines. Whereas if you were to actually get the messages from, in some cases, centralized authorities on nutrition, and in other cases, just nutrition researchers on average, things haven't really changed at all. So I think that you do have to be clear on what you actually mean when you talk about nutrition education, because in some cases people just don't really know like what is reliable information, what isn't reliable information, and that's obviously exploited then through media.
Yeah, that's what I was going to go on to as well, especially with social media.
Yeah,
Like whatever about we'll call it the established media representation, that's gotten more and more and more clickbaity as, I don't know, my life, your life has
yeah,
progressed since the invention of the internet, I suppose. And that obviously leads to a situation where like nutritional science communication gets worse because like if you publish a study that says yes, calories are the cause of obesity, like that's not going to be something that a newspaper can put out and get a load of clicks onto their website. Whereas if you go find a study, get a study, publish a study that says like you said, like eggs cause this, or butter causes this or whatever, people are like, oh my god, I eat butter, I have to see what this says. So again, like the established media representation of nutritional knowledge has been quite poor. But then obviously with the rise of social media, this is even exacerbated further because not only are like newspapers trying to sell, now you've got all these different individuals in the market trying to sell. So they're also trying to distinguish themselves with a new diet or a new way or a new take on nutrition or whatever it is. There's these detox teas and the issue is detox, and whatever it is that we've talked about before on the podcast, and most call them evidence-based individuals would call out in terms of being bad nutritional science, bad practices within this whole sphere. And like those two things have been really bad for the education side of things, right? And then layering on top of that, the overall education around, like we'll call it food advertising, like the way food is advertised. And this even goes down to something we'll get on to later on in terms of like policy, but also in terms of the food advertising around how they label products in terms of the nutritional facts on the back. They try all these things where it's like, here's a red box to signify that this is a high calorie dense food, but they put these labels on the foods, but that doesn't mean that they communicate the science in terms of how to interpret those labels. you know, and that's obviously an issue, because you can do all that you want, like introduce this traffic light system or introduce this, you know, points system or whatever you can think of, but if the people on the street don't know how to interpret and use that system, like it's irrelevant. Like imagine having traffic lights on the road that nobody knew what they meant. They were just all driving on whatever color they saw. They had no interpretation of it. So the education side of things around that as well, very poor, you know. And the next thing on top of that is, you know, there's no, like obviously you do have like the market provides in terms of, you know, you have like your Jamie Olivers and whoever else teaching people how to cook, but it's not like there's some cooking education as part of the, you know, your schooling. You know, it's not like in primary school or secondary school or your third level education that you get like mandatory cooking education. Like it's not a thing, right? And that obviously leads to a society that clearly doesn't value cooking, right? And that obviously leads to further outcomes where people aren't able to cook. Like the amount of, like obviously, like I'm a guy, I presume you're a guy, don't want to assume, but it leads to a situation where like I definitely know a good few lads that are in my friend group, or, you know, I went to school with or whatever, that legitimately can't cook. Like they literally beans on toast. That's all they're able to cook, you know, like the entire time they lived at home. Like maybe they made a sandwich for themselves or a toasty if they were feeling, you know, exotic. But they literally would make cereal in the morning. Like there's no preparation needed for that, you know, a sandwich for lunch. And then they would have whatever was going for the evening meal in terms of whatever their parents cooked, you know. And obviously if you introduce them then out into the free world, we'll call it, and they have no cooking skills, like the only thing that's left for them to get in the evening is either to make another sandwich or it's to order out, you know, until they hopefully find someone else, a partner that can cook. But even then it's like, do you really think your partner is going to cook every single meal for you? Do you think that's an equitable situation to be in? You know, it's not, that's not a great way to structure your life. And again, it comes down to the situation where we just didn't get education in terms of cooking at the beginning stages, whatever, you know. And obviously again, like, and it's something that we'll touch on again with the overall structuring of society, which is another thing we'll get onto. Like there is some parental responsibility as well within this, but we'll get on to that. Do you have anything else to add to that? Because there's only one more thing I want to touch on, the education side of things.
Yeah, like I think that like food preparation skills are something that you do see coming up time and time again, and it does go beyond cooking as well. You know, there's other things that, you know, you mightn't even think of, like, all right, how do you get the most out of your vegetables? You know, how are you gonna prepare them and store them and make sure that, you know, and you know, just different knowledge related to food, and
Even
then how to
shopping
cook
like
it.
for it, it's
Yeah,
like,
all that sort of stuff.
how do you like, where's the veg, what should I get, like what goes together in a meal? Like, yeah, all these food preparation skills, they're just non-existent in quite a lot of people.
Yeah, and you see that come up as a barrier in lots of the qualitative research again, that, you know, it's not necessarily just that people don't know what to eat, but they don't necessarily know how to put together a meal that is both healthful, as well as being, you know, tasty and something that they can give to their kids. And that is definitely something that you do need to consider. Particularly, like, I think when you are an adult, like, for example, like personally, I'm very easygoing. Like, as in, if I'm looking for a meal and I'm like, look, I want protein and fiber in this meal, they're my priorities. Like, I'll just pour some kidney beans into a bowl and not cook them and just take some leftover chicken, like whatever's there. Like, it's not a big deal to me. But if I was a parent and I was trying to feed my kids and I was trying to, you know, make sure that they're healthy, that's a totally different story, because I have to find a way to make it palatable. So, you know, it's tasty, that there's a good mouthfeel, that maybe it's similar to other foods that they like. And that's actually a lot more complicated. And they're basically the roots of the children's food behaviors going forward then. So there is a lot more to it. And I think that sometimes as individuals who go to the gym, we kind of lose sight of that, because we're all in the game. We're like, yeah, bro, you know, I'll cook chicken and rice and broccoli and I'll just eat that. That's fine. But, you know, try and feed that to your kids, you know, and that's where things get a bit more complicated. So food preparation skills, really, really important.
Yeah, and this even goes into like people basically coddling their kids throughout their life, right? Like I know that my two youngest brothers, neither of them can cook for fucking shit, right? Like if you put them out in the wild right now and be like, yeah, here, you won the lotto, here's a house for you, they genuinely don't know how to cook their own food. Like I have to literally make my brother eggs when he wants them. You know, like like he can't cook. And like how do you solve that? Obviously, like you said, like there's parental stuff in terms of the beginning nutrition stuff where you might be very easygoing, but you have to create meals for your kids to get good nutrition. And if you don't have great cooking skills, that's going to be an issue. But even then, if you do have great cooking skills and you're able to navigate that whole situation, like there comes a point where you have to impart those skills to your children, right? And again, that can not happen where they have stuff going on. Oh, he's doing sports, she's doing sports, they have this extracurricular thing or whatever it is, or they have homework to do or whatever, and you just want to get the dinner done quickly after you've had a hard day in work, whatever's going on. Like life is obviously hard, and these critical skills don't get imparted onto the next generation. And you have people that are 16, 17, 18, 19, and they've never cooked a meal in their life, right? So they've gone through roughly a quarter of their life having never cooked a meal. And it can easily happen that these individuals have never cooked an actual meal. I don't just mean they made a toasty or whatever. Like they haven't actually cooked a substantial like family meal, and then they go out into the world and they don't have these skills. So obviously that's a huge education around nutrition thing that can lead to obesity, because if you're left not being able to cook and you don't know how all these other, like we'll call them soft skills around cooking and nutrition education, like you don't know where to buy food, you don't know how to navigate that situation. It's always been done for you. And now you're out in the free world, you're like, okay, like I'm just going to have to get stuff that's quick and easy to get and cook, because like, can I bang it into the microwave? That's all I can really do. I can turn on the microwave. Great. Or, I can order from the local Chinese or the chipper or the pizza place or whatever it is, the kebab shop, whatever, insert whatever fast food. That's the only way they can get any nutrition. And again, that's not a great place to be in terms of this obesogenic environment that we've created. And then the final thing just on that, which is somewhat related to the kind of the soft skills around nutrition, and this is like education around money management. And like you might be thinking like, what's that have to do with nutrition? But obviously, again, you need to know how to budget accordingly to, like, people aren't aware that it can be cheaper to get, we'll call it good wholesome food, for cheaper than you would get fast food. But obviously, again, we have to factor in all the stuff that we were just talking about, and we'll further talk about in terms of like the time aspect and the food environment. We'll get onto all those kind of things. But obviously, this does play a role to whatever extent in terms of your ability to have good nutrition. You have to have good money management practices. You have to be able to delay gratification. And these are all soft skills or hard skills, whatever you want to call them, that often get overlooked and do have a place in this overall pathogenesis towards obesity. Now, to what extent? Like, you could have great money management skills, be a millionaire, and still be obese. Like, I'm not saying that's the be all and end all, but obviously it does fit into this overall discussion of education around nutrition. Like, you can have all the greatest education around nutrition, but if you don't know how to manage your money, like, we're in a bad spot, and again, this ties into quite a lot of the other things that we're going to touch on, and obviously stuff that we're not going to touch on that obviously play into it. Like, we could talk about jobs in your environment. Like, if there's just no jobs, there's just shit jobs in your environment that don't pay well. It's like, you can have all the best money management skills in the world, but you can only manage so much. But obviously that's kind of beyond the scope of what we want to talk about. So the education around nutrition. Anything else you want to add to that?
Well, just on the money management side of things, like, it's also the case that, like, if you don't have much money, you don't have much to manage. And as a result, like, your food budget can be severely limited. So I think, like, that's something that's always important to remember, because it is very easy to just kind of get caught in the idea that, oh yeah, everyone obviously has this budget to eat the things I eat, whereas that's just not always the case. And like a one way to think about that would be, let's say you did only have 50 euros left at the end of the week by the time, let's say, you've bought everything else you needed to buy. Okay, stuff, you've bought stuff for your kids, you needed to buy uniforms, you needed to pay the bills, pay the rent, etc. And you've got 50 euros left to spend on food. Like, imagine that you're in a position where like you already really don't enjoy your life, like your kids are kind of always giving you shit and stuff, and you're like, oh god, like I just want to put a nice tasty meal on the table so that I can enjoy it and so that the kids can enjoy it, or get a takeaway each week or whatever. So the point there being that while you can manage your money and you can say, oh, why don't people just buy the 19-cent cans of chickpeas? They're so healthy. Just eat those in a bowl. Like, think about how that actually plays out in the real world. You know, it sounds like something that's manageable, particularly if you're someone who's like a personal trainer that has a background in bodybuilding. Like, but the reality is that like try to serve that up to your kids. Like, it's not as simple, you know. So sometimes it is a case that like part of money management isn't necessarily directed towards just the resources that are going to be most healthy, but also those that might actually add a bit of pleasure to life as well, which is completely fair, you know.
100%. So yeah, anyway, that's something. It's pretty much beyond the scope. Like, we're not a wealth generating podcast yet anyway.
Yes.
But so yeah, like, obviously there's a load that goes into that, and this is not the podcast to unpack all of that. Anyway, moving on. So the next thing then is something that you would think, especially personal trainers and the field that we find ourselves in, you think people would think about this a little bit more, but they don't. And that is food availability and cost. And obviously this ties in with a lot of what we just said. And there's two concepts that I want to introduce, and perhaps Gary, you will explain what they are, if you will. And these are food deserts and food swamps, right? Because these are two things that, again, if you come from, hate when people say words like this, but if you come from a privileged background, like, you may not even understand the realities of other people's upbringing in terms of what they've been exposed to or the environments that they find themselves in through no fault of their own, right? Now, obviously, sometimes it is through fault of their own, but again, that's a moral discussion or an ethics discussion or whatever you want to call it, and that's beyond the scope of this podcast. But people do find themselves in these food deserts and food swamps. So what are they, Gary?
Yeah, so like these are two. You might have heard of food deserts. I think food swamps is a newer concept, but food deserts are fundamentally areas with limited access to affordable and nutritious food. Okay, so that's the typical definition. So, you know, if you're in an area that's, you know, very very wealthy on average, let's say, you might have, you know, these kind of like organic, like artisan stores that are, you know, available to you. And, you know, you've got the cafe and they sell all the kind of like vegan organic products and stuff. So it's like part of the culture, but it's also like, you know, it's bringing you what you want as well. You know, you might have a Marks and Spencer's instead of an Aldi, and, you know, these types of things. Not that you can't get healthy food in Aldi, but they're just examples of how that might differ from another environment, where you might have, well, firstly, that I should define a food swamp as well. So food swamp is basically where you have a higher density then of establishments selling high calorie fast food. Okay, so for example, the local chipper, the kebab shop, a McDonald's, etc. That would be regarded as a food swamp. Also, things like convenience stores where you've got a high density of things like chocolate bars and convenience snacks and sugar sweetened beverages, etc. So you can imagine that if you're in an area then that has a high density of those fast food and convenience stores, and you've got a low density of places that are offering affordable, nutritious food, then clearly that's not an environment that's conducive of the most healthful food choices. And that tends to be what you see, is that like food swamps more than food deserts, it seems that food swamps tend to lead to higher rates of consumption of those types of high calorie dense foods, and thus obesity or obesogenic behaviors as a result. And this is a challenge, because what you do see is that you see that food swamps are typically concentrated in areas that are typically poorer or of low socioeconomic status. And if you look to the US as an example, because it is kind of a good example for answering this type of question, you do see that they're more prevalent as well in areas with higher densities of ethnic minorities. So this is one of those cases where you've actually got a lot of different variables that are acting together to lead to the emergent outcome of higher rates of obesity. So for example, if you've got low socioeconomic status, so on average people are less wealthy, there's more poverty, you've got less access to nutritious foods, let's say, but you've also got a high density of fast food restaurants. So, you know, you go down the chipper and there's a great deal, burger, chips, and a can of Coke for a fiver. Fantastic. You didn't want to cook this evening. You know, you don't have much money left for the weekend. You want to go for a few cans or whatever. Let's get the chipper, you know, handy, very simple, quick, done. So you've got that variable. But then what you've also got, which is something that, you know, I've heard raised by people who are speaking for ethnic minorities in the US, where they'll say things like the US dietary guidelines are very much based on the white people culture, because, you know, if you look at dietary patterns between blacks versus whites in the US is a very crude comparison. There are very clear differences in dietary patterns, and as a result, the dietary guidelines are less concordant with what Black Americans are typically more likely to eat. So you've kind of got this weird situation in which there's both a chicken and an egg, because if you say, like, if we were to talk about our own dietary preferences, for example, like, we love burritos already, you know, so we love burritos. If a burrito store comes near me, I'm going to be likely to eat the burritos. I already love burritos, and it's going to reinforce my desire for burritos. So there's both the prior dietary pattern and how that relates to the food that is near me, and simply the presence of the food itself and how that relates to socioeconomic status. So overall, you've kind of got this causal web that ties together to increase prevalence of obesity along ethnic lines, along socioeconomic status lines, and yeah, it's definitely more complicated than people just, you know, not having motivation.
Yeah, 100%. And like, I drove across like a lot of America, and like, you would literally drive through areas like this, especially in the kind of Midwest kind of area, where it's like there's pretty much nothing, and then you come to this built up area, and there's maybe one like convenience store. It's not even like a supermarket, like a Walmart or anything. It's just a kind of convenience store, even like a 7-Eleven maybe. But then the only other places you could get food were like McDonald's, Burger King, whatever other fast food, you know. And it's like, like if you live in that environment, like how do you eat well if, you know, the convenience store you can go to, like, you're basically in both a food desert and a food swamp, you know, where it's like you don't have access to any good nutrition foods. There's no, like, we'll call them higher end restaurants, or, you know, food places that you can get, we'll call it higher quality food. And then all the places that you can get food, if you're just like, oh, I want to, you know, get food for dinner tonight, and like the 7-Eleven didn't have any chicken because it's a fucking 7-Eleven. Like, what do? You go, okay, cool, I'm going to go down to KFC. Like, that's the only other option I have, you know? So if you find yourself in that environment, like, it's very, very hard to navigate that and stay on track nutritionally, you know? Like, yeah, okay, cool. Like, I literally did navigate those situations because I have a high level of nutritional knowledge, so I was able to, you know, stay within my calories and macros while still eating those foods. But also, like, I'm 100 odd, well, not now, but 100 kilo male, who has quite a high caloric requirement. So I'm like, of course it's going to be easy for me to fit these foods in and still stay relatively on track. But if you're not, well, maybe if you are 100 kilo male when you shouldn't be, like, it's going to be harder for you to navigate that situation, you know. And obviously, again, like, it's not ideal food in terms of the quality of the food that you're eating, but from a calories perspective, it can be managed, but it's just highly unlikely that you are going to be able to manage this effectively. And if that's all you've got around you, like, what do you do? And this is something that we'll come to when we touch on, like, society. Like, what do you do then? You go, oh, there's another town a 2 or 3 hour drive away from me that does have a bigger supermarket. I'm going to go there and get my food for the week, because that's what people would do. Like, I talked to a few people there in these various places, because I like to chat shit. But you know, that's what they would do. They'd be like, okay, cool, I go to this other area to get food for the week. you know. But again, what happens if you're on a Friday night, they didn't have enough chicken for the week or beef or whatever it is that you're buying? Like, your only other option is shit food, you know. And obviously it becomes increasingly hard to manage your calories in that situation. Now, you might think, oh, well, that's America, it's completely different. I live in Ireland, England, Australia, I don't know, Dubai. Like, we've listeners all around the world, right? Like, you might be like, that's not the same in my area. However, it is the same in various areas in at least the Anglosphere. So like, it's happening, you just aren't aware of it. You know, maybe you do come from an area that you're like, you're hearing us talk about this and you're like, yeah, that's like where I grew up. Like, I remember when I grew up, like I live in Sandyford, and when I grew up, like, it's not like it is now. Like, it's been, again, a term I hate, but it's been gentrified now. Like, the area, like, we didn't have Dundrum town center, you know, and that's like, oh, like, we have all high end stuff, you know. We had like it was an industrial estate. It literally was like, I grew up in an industrial estate, and people come to it now and they see these like high rise apartments and they're like, oh, it's a really nice area. But like, I literally was on the edge of the fucking county, like, of Dublin. Like, there was barely any houses above me on the mountain. I basically live halfway up a mountain, you know. And the only shops you could go to, like, there was a Crazy Prices, which is kind of like a super value, like a smaller supermarket, and there was a super value. And but other than that, it's like the only other places around you were like the Chipper, you know, and like, I think there was a kebab shop or something, or the Chinese as well. You know, it's like, that's the food you can get. You know, you can definitely, especially if you have a car, drive to other areas that were more built up at the time. And like, Nook Grove was an area, so that's, people who are familiar with these areas, they'll know. And then obviously Stillorgan as well was another area that you could go to. But like, we were in between those. So like, again, like, I know from my youth it was completely different. And now obviously it's been gentrified. Loads of people with higher wealth have moved into the area. And like, Gary, you've been here. Like, there's more supermarkets. There's the town center that was like biggest in Europe. Like, there's all these different things that have popped up that just weren't there in my youth, you know. And I know where you grew up, Gary, as well. Like it was not even what it is now in terms of how built up it is, and in terms of the food that you had access to. Like, I know you used to fucking go to McDonald's basically for your nutrition when you were growing up.
All the time.
That's why you
Yeah,
couldn't do
like,
any
even
push-ups at 16.
or why I became able to do them, because I ate more McDonald's.
And also, we
But no,
should
like,
mention you were a professional dancer at that time, so
I was, yeah,
there's that.
you know, pro. But yeah, no, McDonald's is literally right next to my house. A stone's throw away, but I'm very good at throwing stones. So I mean, you know, it's still pretty far away. But yeah, no, we used to do that all the time, and it actually was so convenient because of the Eurosaver menu. Like, I would just get a cheeseburger, €2, 6 nuggets, €2, put a couple of nuggets into the cheeseburger, and that's literally €4. And then you might have a fiver if you were given a fiver. So then you might get a little hamburger on top of that as well. So it's pretty handy in that sense. But yeah, like, obviously that was something that obviously drove my nutrition decisions, because like, when we were growing up, we would be playing soccer all the time for just like literally 8 hours a day, or we'd be, I don't know, climbing, because as you say, it wasn't as built up, but it was in the process of being built up. So we always had like building sites around my housing estate when I was growing up, but we were always like super active. So as a result, despite the fact that we'd eat McDonald's regularly and stuff like that, whenever I got money, I didn't get money to go to the shop as much as a lot of my friends did, which was probably good for me in the end. But like, that was always there. And if that wasn't there, then it would have been the case that all of my friends would have been more likely to just go home for lunch or go home for a snack. Whereas because it was so close, it was always really convenient. Whereas if you lived out in Glenflesk or something, which is just 15 minutes from Killarney, but it's more rural, then you wouldn't have those options. Like, you wouldn't have the option to go to a fast food place. You might be lucky to find a store nearby, but unlikely. You know, a lot of the people I know from the country wouldn't have a store to walk to within walking distance, you know. So those things undoubtedly affected my childhood, and undoubtedly affect them for a lot of other people as well.
And again, it's something that people don't think about, that does clearly play a role in this we'll call it obesogenic environment that we find ourselves in, you know. And again, that's something that we will discuss in future episodes, and a little bit more in one of these other ones, these other points. And And then we actually did touch on that basically just there in terms of like these high calorie, low nutrition foods are generally cheaper. And that's, I'm putting that with like a little asterisk beside it, because like you see these people where they go through like this, how is this cheaper? It's like, here's this amount of protein that you need, and here's this carbohydrates you need. And they literally compare like going to Aldi, all these soft skills that we just touched on in terms of they know where to shop, they know how to get the best deal, blah, blah, blah. But they rarely ever factor in the fact that this just took them 3 hours to go around these shops, get all these foods, prepare these foods, when it literally takes you 15 minutes. If the, like you said, the McDonald's is a stone's throw away from you, literally take you 5 minutes to drive there, if even, you know, because obviously you're not walking, and then get your food, get your order, and it's put in your car if it's a drive-through, and then you're gone back to your house, eating your food there, all within 15 minutes. No preparation, no whatever, no cleanup. You literally throw it in the bin, like, you know. So again, there's clear differentiation in terms of those two environments that you can find yourself in. And so the fact that you have easy access to these high calorie, low nutrition foods, which are also cheaper in the short term, the long term, I don't know what you want to think of it. Like that's obviously not a great situation to find yourself in if you are trying to not be obese, right? Do you have anything else to say on that?
Nope.
Further to that, like low satiety foods are also generally cheaper, you know? And you would think it would be the opposite way in terms of like you would basically be paying for calories. So like higher calorie dense food would be more expensive, but like that's rarely the case. And that's obviously like because of the inputs, also because of like stuff like subsidies, like the government gives, and, you know, the overall food production system, which is something we'll touch on in a second. Like that's the situation that we find ourselves in. Like it's far cheaper to, I don't know, go in and get something that doesn't really make you feel full. Like literally you could eat a McDonald's, and even though it's high in calories, like it's not very filling, you know? Like it's not something that you, an hour later, you're like, geez, I'm still stuffed after that, you know? Like it's just not, right? Like you literally could have a 2,000 calorie McDonald's meal and within 2 hours eat again. You know, it's not satiating, right? Whereas if you had 2,000 calories of, like Gary has mentioned, like kidney beans or chickpeas or something, first of all, you probably fucking shit yourself. But second of all, like you're probably going to be very satiated for days. Like you're just not going to want to eat, you know? So like there's clearly a difference in terms of the foods you have available to you, and then also like the way you interact with the food environment. Both, like I'm not absolving just your choice in this. Like there is obviously an element of choice, which is something we will discuss in future episodes as well. But like it's all these little barriers, but then also little incentives that play into it, where, you know, we could say it's just an argument of choice, but in reality it's like the environment is nudging you towards certain choices, right? Do you have anything else to say on that?
Would now be an appropriate time to just mention how that interacts with your psychology / neurobiology very briefly?
I will allow it, yes.
Yeah, just on the environment point, like Paddy just mentioned there, that like you're fundamentally being nudged in a particular direction, whether you like it or not. So your response to food cues, to advertising, etc., your proximity to your nearest grocery store, all that sort of stuff, right? And there are inter-individual differences in your susceptibility to those cues. Okay, like this is it's an area of research that's difficult to get like proper, like clear granularity on it. But what you do see is that in studies related to neuroimaging, so imaging of the brain, there are differences between how different people respond to food cues, and that can then predict responses in terms of weight loss or weight gain, feeding behavior, etc. And there's lots of different areas of the brain that correlate with feeding behavior and response to food cues, often areas related to reward and emotion. So places like the amygdala, the cingulate gyrus, the hypothalamus, and then you've got all those limbic areas, but you've also got regions related to kind of higher order cognitive function that might override those emotional signals. And you don't have to worry about the details there. But what's worth noting is that in studies looking at obese individuals versus people of normal weight, you see things that are quite interesting when it comes to thinking about like decision making, free will, personal responsibility, etc. Because what you can see is that even after a meal, when someone is already full, that they still remain, like obese individuals remain more responsive to food cues than people at a normal weight. So even though we might look at a meal and say, you know, on a so-called objective level, that we'd be saying, look, this meal has this level of satiating value because of its fiber content, its palatability, its protein content, its calorie content, etc. That the it doesn't necessarily result in the same response from every individual. So some individuals might, you know, prior to the meal, first and foremost, have a different response for liking of foods, but also desiring of foods, and that can then remain kind of salient, you know, afterwards when you're already should be full, or you report being full. Like even if I finish a meal and I report that, yeah, I'm full after that meal, I'm satisfied, there still might be a difference in terms of how I'm responding to those food cues, and how someone else is responding to those food cues. So even though you obviously have choice in the matter, and you obviously are able to control your diet, like we clearly do those things, it's not necessarily the same for everyone. And as a result, this accounts for at least some portion of why certain individuals are going to be more susceptible to developing obesity in the obesogenic environment that we're all exposed to than other individuals. And I think that is something that's important to understand, because very often we do just kind of pat ourselves in the back and say, oh, well, you know, I just prep my meals, that's all I do, you know, whereas it might be the case that you actually are just less likely to respond to food cues than someone else, along with other factors, of course.
Yeah, and there's such inter-individual differences, and also just your response at different time points in your own life, in terms of like your response when you're absolutely shredded versus your response when you are, you know, I don't know, 20-30% body fat. Like there are differences even in that, in terms of like, what I mean is like your body is not the same entity throughout the lifespan, just in terms of like, this is obviously a discussion of like body fatness. So even in terms of that, like there are differences that occur. So like if you're an individual who is eating like these high satiety foods like fruits, vegetables, you know, protein, you're getting all this in, and you're in this semi-lean state, we'll say like, oh, you have visible abs or whatever, you know, like that's a different environment than someone, like even if you ate the same foods as someone who is eating in this obesogenic way, like that's not to say that you have the same, we'll call it like neuroendocrine response to those food cues, to someone that is obese, you know, and especially if you start layering on early childhood development and early childhood exposure and like changes in like the fucking GABAergic system as a result of like childhood trauma and whatever other stuff. Like again, like that's the real reason that I actually care about this stuff, because I'm like, it actually fundamentally changes children. And like we'll get onto it in future podcasts. But when you actually look at the policies that people implement in and around this area, like in my mind, I'm like, if you just look after children, I'm like, it's basically like investing in the future, because like they literally are your future. They're the future of the economy, the country, etc. But then people implement policies that negatively impact children, and I'm like, this. If you do this when they're children, they're basically fucked for life. That's again my pessimism around this whole thing, where I'm like, you know, if you get fucked up as a child, you're kind of on the back foot already, you know. And there's a few policies I can think of just off the top of my head, which I'm just like, this is actually just reckless. Like Maggie Thatcher, who we will talk about in a future episode. They used to call her Maggie Thatcher Milk Snatcher, because she wanted to cut the funding for giving milk to kids. You know, it's like, this is like reckless stuff, you know. But anyway, like that's for a future episode. But yeah, also the neuroendocrine, the neurobiology stuff, that's also for a future episode. But like it's a lot deeper than we're just talking about now, and it also brings in all these like I call them philosophical or moral debates, and stuff that, again, like you don't think that your everyday actions or the everyday actions of other people influencing your life, do they actually influence your life? But then they start bringing up all these, you know, questions around free will and whether you are actually, you know, making your own decisions and stuff. But again, future episodes. So, yeah, the next thing then, and again, this goes into these kind of soft skills and also the environment around food. Like fruit and veg goes off, right? So like processed food doesn't, and that's something that again you need to take into account with this whole food availability and cost. Like if you have a situation where you don't know how to prepare and extend the shelf life of these foods, and you can easily buy, I don't know, frozen chicken nuggets, and like there's like in certain circumstances you can see why people make the choices that they do, because they're thinking like, oh look, I could literally get this fresh chicken here or whatever, but like it's not going to be good to go in a week's time, whereas I can get this huge bag of chicken nuggets. Yeah, they're breaded and whatever else, it's obviously different, but they'll last because I just bang them to the freezer, take out a few when I need them, where it's not the same as like, oh, I got these chicken breasts and I'll take out a few when I need them. Like, yeah, you could say that that's the case. It's very similar, but it's not really. Because again, there's a whole like knowledge around how to process this food, how to extend the shelf life of this food, all those soft skills that we were talking about before, right? And we touched on these two because these also go into the food deserts and food swamps. But again, certain shops in your area and your ability or the transportation ability to those shops, like that's obviously varies hugely across just Ireland, the country that we're in right now, but also England, across the world. Like obviously it's hugely different if you live in London versus if you live up in fucking, I know, Strathclyde somewhere, like it's a huge difference in terms of the actual environment you find yourself in. And obviously that has impacts in terms of your overall health. Do you have anything else to add on to the food availability and cost side of things, Gary? Like obviously we're not touching on everything, but I just want to hit some like big key areas that people can kind of start thinking a bit more about.
Yeah, no, that sounds good.
Right, now the next one, and again, these are two things. Well, the first one especially is something that like it's actually far more dull than most people make it out to be in terms of the actual discussion of this. And this is the topic of like fat shaming, right? Like people make it out on both sides of, I'm not talking about just one individual, like one side of the equation, like on both sides, people make it out to be like, oh, if you do any little microaggression against fat people, it's fat shaming and that's toxic and whatever else. And then on the other side of it, it's like, oh, you should shame fat people because it'll lead to better health outcomes. And it's like let's read realistic. Like the answer is probably somewhere in between those two standpoints. But the only thing I want to say on this is like fat shaming as a concept. Like again, we'll probably talk about this in future episodes because it's very interesting in terms of the social experiment that is going on in terms of how people respond to the topic and how people then utilize that topic overall. But again, like we'll touch on it in future episodes. But the one thing I do want to say is that like if you were, again, I think of the children because realistically, look, if you're over 12, I'm like, you're already fucked. I'm sorry. Like, yeah, that's my mindset. So I'm like, this is obviously something that we need to look into for a properly functioning society, with the children aspect in mind, because that's all I really care about. Like this, if you are someone that has been exposed to trauma, whatever fuck else in your childhood, and you use food as a coping mechanism, and then you are fat shamed, and your only coping mechanism is food, like you can clearly see how that leads to a situation where you get further into this obesogenic environment because you don't have any coping mechanisms apart from emotional eating to deal with that. So how is fat shaming going to benefit that individual, right? So yeah, this obviously does go into the overall discussion. Do you have anything to say on the topic of fat shaming? Because like we're going to talk about it on a future episode, but I just want to say that it is in this whole obesogenic timeline.
Yeah, like fat shaming and or weight stigma generally like is something that obviously is worth bringing into this discussion, because you'll hear some people, make claims that, well, no, we should just be shaming because that's what we did with tobacco and everyone stopped smoking. Whereas like if you actually look at tobacco policy, it's far more complicated than that and far more interventionist than anything related to obesity has been. So you should try and understand tobacco policy first. But in addition to that, like you do see that like weight stigma can have deleterious effects, because an example would be, like if you're, let's say, seeking some sort of medical care, and you know you've got some sort of health complaint, and your doctor says that, oh no, it's just the result of your weight, you should lose weight first, then that's potentially serious for your health, because it might have been a totally independent problem that could have been treated and managed well, which obviously isn't good medical care. And the difficult thing then is that people may not be willing to seek care again, and that's where things can become a bit messy. It can obviously also happen as a personal trainer. Like a lot of trainers listen to this, and you know, if you're someone who's constantly outspoken about how, you know, people who are obese are just lazy and useless and they don't care about themselves, and you're just like thinking that's going to be a positive thing, then obviously they're less likely to then reach out to you. And if you're a competent professional, then it's a very clear example of how that person isn't able to actually move forward and be successful. But in addition to then, like the things that you said, that it can be a stressor in and of itself, and it can, as you say, bring up past trauma potentially if someone has been bullied throughout their life for their weight, or it just might be a consideration where, you know, someone feels really shit about their weight, they're, you know, disgusted when they look in the mirror or whatever, and that can potentially then feed into a kind of a cycle of like there's obviously a lot of debate in the literature on it. Food addiction, or things related to food addiction, like the reward that comes from food, whether or not you want to call it an actual addiction is up for debate. But if you're more responsive to food cues and food reward, and that's one means of dealing with that, then that's then the fat shaming and weight stigma are very much tied in with that. So tied in with the kind of stress response, and then with the act of overfeeding itself. So yeah, it's definitely not as simple as just not or as just as shaming people to change their behavior. But on the other side of things, you also don't necessarily want to go to the extreme that some people do, and like claim that there are no deleterious effects of obesity in an attempt to not fat shame people, because that's just not telling the truth. And I see very few cases in which withholding the truth and therefore lying to people is a good thing, you know.
I couldn't agree with you anymore, right? Anyway, it's an incredibly dull conversation, but we will have it in future because there's a few things that people are exposed to in society, social media, whatever, and hopefully, like, again, we'll discuss it in future. But anyway, the other thing then, and this in my mind is actually a far more interesting phenomena that you notice, and this is fat betterment stigma, right? Or you could put it in terms of like fit shaming, right? So like you see this where individuals who were previously overweight or obese, and they go out and, you know, we'll say try to better themselves in terms of their cardiovascular risk, their obesity risk, whatever. They try to get healthier, right? And then they lose some weight. And then individuals basically, you know, cannibalize them in terms of, they're like, oh my God, I can't believe you lost that weight. I always respected you when you were overweight, or you had more weight on your body, blah, 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 right? And you're like, this is actually reckless. These individuals are trying to better themselves. And I thought we were all about body acceptance, and this individual clearly is happier in their new form in terms of they've lost some weight. And they've done this as a task that they wanted to undergo. It's not like, you know, they, I don't know, had cancer and they were losing weight as a result, you know. It's like, this is something that they've thought highly enough about, that they wanted to go out and achieve. And then their peers in society who would have been giving them accolade before, and because they carried more weight, now we're like, oh my God, I can't believe you did this to us. Like the one that comes to my mind is Adele. Now I literally have no idea who the fuck Adele is, but I do know that she got a huge like pushback in terms of, she lost weight, then came out with a few like photos, I think it was on her social media or Instagram or something, yeah, and got a huge backlash in terms of people saying like, I'm never listening to your music again, and I can't believe you were a symbol to all of us women who were bigger. I can't believe you did this to us. And I'm like, this is actually reckless, because you see this in just society. Like obviously we're in the fitness industry, and you see this a lot. Like you'll talk to individuals who are, you know, fitter than normal, and they get this kind of fit shaming in terms of people are like, oh, I wouldn't want to look like you. You're too shredded, or you look better when you have a little bit of weight on you, and all these kind of things, you know? And it's like you wouldn't say those things to a fatter individual or a bigger individual be like, oh, you'd look better if you lost some weight, you know, like obviously that does happen to individuals, but it always, like consistently, the general population says it to fit people. However, my opinion on it is kind of like, look, realistically, I don't care, you're shredded, who cares? Like, you know, like you're getting all the health outcomes from that, and like, yeah, okay, cool, your peers are like, oh, I prefer you with a bit more weight on you or whatever. I'm like, literally their opinion in my mind anyway. I'm like, I don't care, right? But obviously, again, I can see how that would affect some individuals a bit more. But this fat betterment stigma, like it doesn't make sense to me at all. But again, maybe that's just my mindset. Nothing to say on that, Gary, no?
I suppose the only thing I would add would be, yeah, this actually did come up. Well, it's kind of related. When we posted our podcast a couple of weeks ago, or I suppose it was the last episode of the podcast, was it? Where we were talking about the quote basically on the podcast image that I put up on Instagram. I think it was, obesity and overweight prevalence has been on the rise. You know, why is that? Something along those lines. Um, and the response I got from a good friend, actually a very smart friend as well, she was basically just asking, where does this fit in with the idea of loving your body, as if like we can't kind of acknowledge that this is a problem that on average I think we can all agree, and I think that anyway, that if a population is becoming more overweight and obese, that's a net negative thing. I think that's a fairly reasonable statement. However, you know, she was asking, you know, how does this fit in with kind of the idea of loving your body and self-love and all that sort of stuff? And I guess my perspective on that is that, like, firstly, I don't think that, like, I know this is kind of harsh, but I don't think that loving your body is actually that important. Like, I think that sometimes what can happen is people actually put too much emphasis on their bodies, and that can be pathological. So I just want to make it clear, because I think that's something that comes up a lot in the fitness industry, and it's often on the opposite side of things, that when people get lean, they become totally obsessed with their body and they forget that there's more to life than just that. So if anything, I'm kind of like body neutrality. Like, yeah, if you like your body, that's great, but you don't have to, you know. Hopefully there's more to you in your life than just, you know, how you look. I'm kind of that opinion. But also, like, you can still very much be appreciative of your body and have good body image while having the intention of reducing your weight, of losing body fat. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're saying that you hate yourself because you want to go ahead and lose weight. So if you're in a position where you're saying to yourself, you know, I'm actually comfortable with how I look, I love my body, I accept it as it is, and I don't want to lose weight, all my health markers are in a great place and I'm happy out, more power to you. Absolutely no desire for you to change, doesn't matter to me. But if you're in a position where, like, you've come to love your body, but you have noticed that there are side effects associated with excess body fat that you have, then that's something that you do have to still consider. And they're separate constructs in my eyes. Like, whether or not you love your body and whether or not your body is associated with good or bad health outcomes, they're interrelated for sure, but they still are separate constructs, I think, anyway.
I couldn't agree with you more. Now, the next thing then is this kind of social pressure to socialize through food and drink. Like, I know in Irish culture, that's a big thing. Like, that should be pretty obvious how that plays into this obesogenic environment. If the only way you can have a social life is to go out and consume food or drink, like, obviously that's not, like, you can't, like, it's, if you can't dissociate those two, like, imagine not being able to see your friends unless you're consuming calories. Like, that's obviously not a great place to be in. But again, that's how a lot of society is structured these days. And again, probably something we'll talk about in future. And we touched on this one as well before, earlier on, in terms of like parental modeling, in terms of how you were raised or how you raise your own kids. And this obviously has a place in this whole obesogenic, you know, timeline. And again, like, it should be fairly obvious how that occurs. And obviously that's a multifactorial issue in and of itself. And it's not to say like you're bad parents or your parents were bad if they led you to a situation where you were overweight. You know, like, again, it could be any number of factors that led to that situation. Like, maybe you were a picky eater and they were just fucking tired after work, you know? But anyway, that's obviously a point to understand in this whole causation of obesity. And motorized transport, and I mean this in two ways. Like, first of all, you can have a lack of motorized transport, so you can't get to shops, you can't do your shopping in good areas. But also in the other way, in terms of a lot of individuals have more access to motorized transport, so they don't walk anywhere. Like, people literally get like 1,000 steps per day, so their non-exercise activity thermogenesis is just very low, right? And if you have a commute to work, an hour commute to work, then you have a sedentary job, which, less than 20% of jobs in current society are physically or require physical activity. And if you have a commute to that and back, and you sit at a desk all day, like, physical activity is quite low, and that's obviously part of this whole situation. It's not just the food side of things, it's also your ability to exercise, do you have anything to say on that, Gary?
No.
Cool. The next one then, like, this is also a contentious one, because this is one that goes on both sides of the aisle, and that is like, in terms of like politics, and that's like a lack of jobs in the area, and that can be due to poor policies that have been enacted by government, or it literally, this is, again, gets to the heart of these arguments that we have in society. Like, it could literally be to, foreigners willing to do your job for cheaper, right? So people are like, oh, they took our jobs, in terms of like, people are coming to the area and they're willing to do these lower paid jobs for cheaper, and that drives down the wages in that area. But also then, on the other side of things, in terms of like globalization, jobs in the area are just outsourced to another country that'll do it for cheaper, and again, like, this is not just shifting the blame and being like those foreigners. I'm just saying that obviously has a place in this overall discussion, and obviously it's been politicized, even though, like, if you go through history and you look at different political parties and their beliefs throughout history, like, they are not aligned with where they currently have those beliefs, even like 10, 20, 30 years ago, and like, for example, Labour used to be really anti-immigration, because like most Labour governments, or most Labour parties, or more left-aligned parties, used to be really anti-immigrant, because they understood that it takes away jobs from the people that they supposedly represented, in terms of like union workers. Like, if you get people to come in and they do your jobs cheaper, like, that's like, that goes against the people that are going to be voting for those parties or those policies, right? And obviously that's different than the current Labour or left style governments that, or parties or whatever, that we currently think of, right? But obviously, is, again, like, it's the right, I suppose, like, or conservative style governments, like, there's this whole shift of like, basically, we'll say, quasi-racist or racist ideologies that are laid upon those conservative style individuals. Like, people call them racists, and even if they just bring those topics up, and obviously, like, there's potentially racialized history there as well, but also they are the ones that encourage globalization, because it was a freer market then, and they had easier access to capital. And again, it's like this, then they could turn around and say like, oh, those foreigners are coming to take our jobs. And it's like, your party or your policies are the reason that there's no jobs in these areas, because you sold them out, so again, it's both sides of the aisle. So I know that doesn't jive well when people listen to this and they go, I want them to make a fucking call out for the left, or I want them to make a call out for the right. And we're basically saying that both sides were shit. But anyway, the next thing then is, do you have anything to say on that? Because again, like, it's stuff that we're going to talk about in future.
Just regarding your point, your actual point, your point for the listener is that obviously, if there are less jobs and those jobs are less well paid, that ties in with the socioeconomic relationship with obesity. I presume that was the point. Yeah,
that was the point. Yes.
Yes.
Naturally enough. But anyway, so we live in the same environment as we don't live in the same environment as our ancestors, and this is obviously something that is discussed like a lot in, we'll say, the ancestral movement, the paleo community. Like it takes far less energy to get food in this day and age, versus obviously previous in history, when you had to go out and slay an animal or gather food. And then also, we buy far more processed food than we did 30 or 40 years ago. And again, like, this is a question that we'll explore in future. It's like, is it processed food that is the cause of obesity? And again, obviously it's one of these causes that plays into this whole fucking role, right? And then this is also a topic that, you know, it's rarely discussed, and that is activity deserts. Like there's nowhere to exercise in your area, you know, like there's no gyms, there's no sports clubs, like the area doesn't have like walkways. Like I know you go into like rural Ireland, like you try to go for a walk, it's like, well, where are you going to go for a walk? Like say it gets dark at 4 p.m. here now and you try to go for a walk, it's like you're walking on literally these country roads with no footpath, with no lights, you know. So it's like how are you like you literally have to time your exercise, and I mean just like your daily like NEAT, your non-exercise activity thermogenesis in terms of your steps, and with the fucking solar cycle, and then also with the fact that there's no fucking paths on the road, and then there's no lights, you know. So again, like you can,
and it's always raining.
That's again what I was going to go on to as well. It's like you can also have cultures again, or it's just, I shouldn't say cultures, like countries that, you know, it's snowing, it's raining, it's excessively warm, like, you know, like all of these things, they play into the obesity epidemic, in terms of, you know, you just don't have the ability to exercise, you know, like people, again, like you say, you live in a warm country and you're like, oh, that will solve all your issues. But it's also very, very hard to exercise when it's like 40, 50 degrees Celsius out, you know, like you just get so tired so quickly. And like, obviously if you train in an air conditioned gym, it's like, oh, great. It's fine. But that's not obviously available to everyone. Right. So obviously this activity deserts, this is an issue. And again, it's access to gyms, access to sports. If you just don't, if they're just not in your area, like what are you to do? Like obviously again, you can buy equipment and have it in your house, but like what if you live in an apartment? What are you going to do? Like it's highly likely that you're going to buy 200 kilos worth of gym gear and then fucking be doing your deadlifts and end up fucking bolting through the floor to your fucking neighbor below you, like, you know. So again, your overall access to activity stuff, you know, it plays a role in this whole obesity epidemic. Do you mind to say on that, Gary?
Nope.
There's one that I have here just because we were talking about like the environment in terms of like cold, heat, etc. And like I really don't think this is a huge thing, but you will often see it brought up, and that's like we don't get cold anymore in terms of most people live in like heated environments, and like people start going on and doing these like mechanistic hypotheses in terms of it's like, oh, that leads to less brown fat, and you know that's less like thermodynamically active, and like you burn less calories as a result. And like realistically, it's fucking meaningless, but maybe it plays a very, very small role in this whole thing. But I really don't think it warrants further. Like it's a cool like biochemistry experiment type thing in terms of understanding the difference between brown fat and, you know, just white fat, adipose tissue, and like it's just the mitochondrial differences and etc. But like realistically in the real world, in terms of what this actually means, it's fucking meaningless. Do you want to sound that, Gary?
No, I agree.
Then two more things. Some cultures are like feeder cultures. And what I mean by that, it's like, again, not just to kind of further the point that we basically socialize with food and drink. Like some cultures, they make you eat all the food, right? Like it's well known, especially if you're Irish. It's like an Irish mammy will be like, oh, eat all the food on your plate. Like you have to finish all the food on your plate, you know? And maybe this is like coming back from a fucking famine mentality or whatever, but it's the case that you have to finish your food on the plate. And this obviously ingrains beliefs or habits that you finish the food on your plate, even though it could be excessively calorically dense for what you actually need. But again, you finish the food on your plate. And like if you've ever been in like an Arab household, or like even Persian or whatever, like they're very much feeder cultures as well, in terms of like they would see it as, you know, almost an insult if you finished your plate. You know, it's like, oh, like if you finish your plate, they assume that you want more. You know, like you went full. Like they want you to leave food on your plate because then they know that you got enough, right? Because obviously like they come from a culture where they're basically nomadic travelers. Well, a lot of them are, like the Bedouin and stuff. Like they're nomadic travelers, and like they would rely on the hospitality of other individuals, you know, when they're traveling. So they have this culture where, you know, you want to make sure everyone that comes to your house is very well fed. So again, they have that whole culture going. So again, like if you're in cultures like that, and the way they have their food culture set up, you can be in a more obesogenic environment as a result, because you combine that, imagine being in like a feeder culture and then also having like hyper palatable, high calorie foods. Like that's a recipe for disaster, right? In terms of obesity, right? And again, this is another one, and this next one, that again, you see it put out a lot, or not a lot, but like discussed sometimes in terms of like mechanistic stuff. And that is that like we don't really have infections or parasites or worms or whatever anymore, and they obviously contribute to caloric burn in the body, even though like maybe it's not the way you want it to. And like literally people have done that in the past. Like they literally would get, parasites and they would lose weight. They would use it as a weight loss tool, right? Like tapeworms and shit. So like we don't have that anymore, thankfully enough. Like I don't really want tapeworms. But obviously that does play into the overall environment. And this is stuff that like it doesn't get discussed like nearly enough, because if you grew up after the fucking eradication of tapeworms, like like obviously they're not eradicated, but like it just was never a concern for you. Like you don't really think about it, but like throughout our entire evolution, it probably played a huge role. And like you see people as well, especially when they talk about like ancestral diets, and they talk about like, you see this a lot in the carnivore community when they're like, oh, my super high cholesterol levels are perfectly fine because it's ancestrally, that's the way they would have been. But like they're not living in the ancestral environment. Like all those ancestral environments, they would have had significant parasitic load, which we know leads to reductions in cholesterol, right? Because you're fighting off infection. It's like, this is like, you're not comparing apples to apples here, right? Because you don't live in the same environment. And as we've talked about before, like diet is not an a la carte menu. You don't just pick and choose. It's like, you can't isolate things very well with the diet. Like obviously some things you can, but it takes a hell of a long time to actually fucking isolate the signal from the noise. Like just think about now, like our ability to isolate the signal of saturated fat and its role in like heart disease. Like people are still like, oh, we don't have conclusive studies on this, So like your ability to distinguish signal from noise is very, very low with nutritional science. And even though like, again, like we do have quite a lot of a body of evidence for various things. But people will literally just pick and choose what they believe in terms of the diet. It's like, oh, the diet should look this way because of this one isolated thing. And it's like, you're looking at something in isolation that didn't occur in the past, and you're using an ancestral model,
My dad always tells me I've got worms anyway, so it's still very much in the colloquial language. Anytime I eat one of my mother's dinners, which is just absolutely absurdly large, and because she is a feeder, like she's the perfect example. My dad's just like, you actually have worms. You're disgusting.
Yeah, but he's British, so we don't listen to him.
Fuckers.
Anyway, then the next thing then, and we're nearly there, so bear with us. And I'm not going to get too deep into this one because there's actually a far larger discussion on this. And again, it's something we'll get into the future. But the overall food system has changed, and that's from the farm level to we'll say at the multinational company level, right? Like the whole food system has changed. So we'll do an actual podcast on that rather than just going like, let's pick out a few different things. Like it's completely changed in what it was in the past. So again, it basically leads to a situation where you incentivize poor choices, both because of market forces and government forces. But again, that's something we'll discuss in future. Then obviously, then this is like, these next two are the ones that most people will focus on in terms of how we look at this obesity epidemic, and that is energy balance. Like this clearly plays a role in this whole obesity timeline in terms of, if you want to not be obese, you have to eat less and move more, right? And as we've said, like that's obviously influenced by a huge number of other factors, like we've discussed throughout this entire podcast. But ultimately, that's what it comes down to. It's just an energy balance equation. And that is slightly further modified by like genetics, in terms of you might have different genetic polymorphisms that cause you to, react to different diets differently, and move less or move more or whatever else, or have like down regulation of metabolism, up regulation, whatever. And then obviously there's also a hormonal side to this energy balance equation, and that's both controlled genetically, epigenetically, and then your overall environment as well. But again, this is stuff that we've talked about before, and anyone who listens to this podcast, you're probably well versed in terms of calories in, calories out, in terms of the way that factors into the obesity epidemic and body fatness overall. Do you have anything to say on that, Gary?
Yeah, just to be clear to people, like the whole point of discussing everything else up to now was that it could in some way influence energy balance. So like being poor or of low socioeconomic status doesn't add body fat to you. Okay. There are mediators between that, and energy balance, and thus, the addition of body fat. And like that actually is something that it seems really obvious, but it is worth noting, because what sometimes happens in nutrition studies, especially like studies that aren't carried out by people who are like, they do nutrition science themselves, they basically overcorrect for things. So for example, if we were to say, oh, eating ultra processed foods, it doesn't cause obesity because when you control for calories, there's no change in body weight. Like, that's clearly very dumb, because it acts via increasing your calorie intake. And you see the same thing with a lot of the cholesterol research. Like, for example, people will say saturated fat has no effect on heart disease once you control for cholesterol levels. But again, you shouldn't control for cholesterol levels because they're the mediator. So with all of these factors, if you're ever reading research on them and how they relate to obesity, remember, you don't want to control for calorie intake because that's the mediator. Now, that's not always the case, because sometimes you do want to control for that. Because, for example, if we were asking, does sugar independently increase body fat independent of its effects on calorie intake, then that's actually a different question. And the answer is no. It's all via the increase in calories. So there you go.
100%. And then just further to this, and just to kind of wrap up this topic, and then just touch on a few extra things on top of that, is your overall habits, like the food environment we find ourselves in, society we find ourselves in. Like, these effectively serve to reinforce habits. And if you have good habits and you find yourself in a community, a society, whatever, that allows you to reinforce those habits, like, they can be anti-obesogenic, and then also obviously they can be obesogenic in terms of the habits that you get reinforced in your society, your community, whatever, can lead you to struggle to control your weight. Like, yeah, it's still within your willpower to control it, but it's always going to be an uphill struggle. And obviously, again, willpower is something that we all supposedly have. So that's something that obviously plays into this overall obesity epidemic overall. And again, most discussions of it are incredibly dull, in terms of they're basically arguing different, like, people are just arguing across each other rather than actually arguing the correct points. And maybe that's something we'll look into overall. And then further to that, like, you have like psychological ambivalence. Like, the people are just, they want to change, but either they don't know how, or they're like, oh, I'll start on a Monday, or I'll do it in the future. Like, they are basically ready to make the change, but they never actually do. And obviously, again, that comes from various other factors as well. The next one then as well is your self-esteem. Like, if you have very poor confidence in your ability to succeed just in anything, right? And again, that can be because of your culture, early life experiences, whatever the fuck, right? That leads to a situation that makes you not even want to try, because you don't want to fail. And you have such low confidence in your ability to succeed that you see failure as the more likely outcome. Like, that's literally, like, that's completely different than my mindset, for example. Like, I literally will do something and I'll be like, even if I fail, I'm like, that's just leading me to the point where I'll be able to succeed, right? But other individuals come at that, whatever, event, topic, whatever, and they'll be like, oh, even if I fail, or if I fail, that's, catastrophic, and I'm in the worst position possible now, like I'm a failure, right? And that further reinforces the fact that they're a failure, and then their self-esteem and confidence is lowered. And as a result, they just don't want to try things in future because doing nothing is a safer option than being a failure, right? And again, I've said it to multiple clients. It's like the goal is to teach you, and the goal is to get you to the end point. Like there's a lot of learning that goes along within that, you know? So you have to try and be willing to fail and repeatedly fail until we find the right methods and the right tools and the right whatever to actually navigate the situation that you find yourself in. But again, if you don't have someone guiding you down the path, you know, like it can be incredibly hard. Do you have anything else to say on that, Gary, before I rhyme off the last two?
Nope.
And then the final two is stress and sleep, or lack of sleep. And again, we've touched on those previously on the podcast, so you can go back and listen to them. And obviously we've just talked about it in general, and they are big. They are part of the big four in terms of exercise, nutrition, stress management, and sleep. Like they're the big four things that you kind of have to look after to be healthy. Now, obviously there's a huge amount more that goes into it, but those are the kind of fundamental things that you kind of need to look at. Right. So Gary, there's clearly a lot of stuff that goes into this obesity causing, or this obesity causation. I don't even know what to title this whole thing, but there's clearly a lot that goes into it.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the best way that you can go and get a comprehensive understanding of this, because like fundamentally what we're doing is just shooting loads of stuff at you, and it doesn't seem that coherent, to be honest, as much as we've tried. And, you know, because there's so many different things that are related to the end product of obesity emerging with rapidly increasing prevalence in the society. If you look at the UK Foresight Initiative produced an obesity systems map in around 2008, I think. But it's a really good way of looking at how all of these different variables interact, because it's visual and it lets you kind of see the bigger picture. And there are a lot of things that go beyond what we have discussed today, because for everything that we've brought up and mentioned, there are many other things that have potentially contributed to that, and result from that as well. So overall, I think that what you need to understand is that when we consider causation, that there are multiple levels of causation. So like fundamentally, like the end of the line is excess energy. Okay, so it's an energy surplus. Like that's fundamentally the mechanism by which all of these different factors become obesity in the end. So it's the mechanism that contributes to the increase in body fat. However, just understanding the mechanism and that most proximal cause of eating more and moving less, that doesn't actually tell you about all of the different things that have contributed to that. So you do have to kind of increase to a higher level of analysis when you're thinking about these problems. You don't necessarily have to on an individual level. Like, for example, if you're a personal trainer, you don't need to consider how economic policies have affected the food environment. Like it's interesting to be aware of that, but fundamentally what you have control over is, you know, what you advise your client to do, the exercise you have them do, the nutrition advice you give them, advice related to modifying their food environment, for example. Like you can control your home food environment. You can control, depending on your financial resources and what you have near you, where you shop. You can control what aisles you enter within the store. Like, so you do have control over things. And I think knowing what is within an individual's control when you are a personal trainer is definitely helpful. I do think as well that there's an interesting thing here as well that potentially accounts for why a lot of trainers, definitely including myself in this box as well, why you end up with a bias towards thinking that everyone should be able to do what you can do. And that's because if you're working with people as a trainer, you are self-selecting for people who are, one, they've made the step to try and better their health and fitness. They've got the financial resources to pay for it. They've got means of transport to getting to your gym. They don't have other commitments that stop them from having that time available. So you're already self-selecting for a small portion of the population. And as a result, if you're not exposed to the rest of the population, you don't see how they live, you don't get the common barriers reported, then you have a skewed perception of the barriers that are in the way for people, because you've only helped people solve problems within the context that they're already actively seeking to make change and they're already got those resources that I mentioned. So that is something that's really important to be aware of as a trainer.
Yeah, and this comes down to like the reason we wanted to record these podcasts is because this both helps us in terms of clarifies our messaging, our thinking, because we have to think deeper about these things when we're trying to be coherent and convey a message, which that's what we like to do. But also it helps the people that we want to influence in terms of the individuals that are trying to better their own health, but also the individuals that are trying to better other people's health in terms of like personal trainers. I know a lot of like healthcare healthcare workers listen to this, so again, like they might have been exposed to different things and different thought processes, so we want to cover a lot of bases with this. But as an individual trying to manage your own obesity risk or own health in general, like half of this stuff is in your control. Like the physiology is kind of like 50-50 whether it's in your control. Like some of it is, some of it's not. Like obviously that's impacted by your habits and all the stuff that we've been talking about. Your individual physical activity, like that's within your own control, and again obviously that's influenced with all the things that we've been talking about and discussed throughout this. Your individual psychology, like again, it's somewhat in your control. Your individual food consumption, again, somewhat in your control. But those are the things that you can work on, right? And that's the stuff that we work on when we're coaching individuals or advising individuals in terms of, how to navigate the food environment, how to navigate the exercise environment. And ultimately that comes down, that stuff is the stuff that we generally tend to recommend. And most personal trainers will recommend, or healthcare providers will recommend. They'll be like, find some sort of physical activity that you can do and do it, right? Like that's basically it. You just have to find some sort of way to burn some calories throughout the week. Could be walking, could be swimming, could be, I don't know what the fuck you have in your area, but you're going to have to find something. It literally could be walking up and down the stairs in your house. You have to find something, like obviously we have a bias towards resistance training because we think it's fucking great. And we also have a bias towards Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu because we think it's great. But like realistically at the end of the day, I could not care less what an individual does in terms of their activity, as long as they are getting some activity in, right? The individual psychology stuff, again, there's a whole host of things that could go into this, but you're going to have to find some way to get your psychology aligned so that you're not have this ambivalent approach to weight loss. You have to find a way to increase your self-esteem and self-confidence. And again, that's beyond the scope of this podcast, but you're going to have to find a way. And then finally, you're going to have to find a way to manage your food consumption. You're going to have to navigate the food environment that you find yourself in, and you're going to have to control for calories in some way, right? I wish there was more that I could give you at an individual level to be like, here's this one weird trick or this one thing that you could do to, stop your obesity risk dead in its tracks. Unfortunately there isn't, right? Because a lot of this stuff is outside your control, like the physical activity environment. Like you don't have control over where you live unless you have, lots of money. Like if you were just born in an area, like you were just born there, and you don't have control over the food production system. And yeah, you could argue that you can just buy different foods or whatever, but as we've discussed, it's not always that easy. You don't have control over food promotion. Like, yeah, okay, cool. You could say, get off your phone. You could say, don't watch TV. But even if you walk down the street while you're trying to increase your activity, you walk by a bus stop and they have, whatever candy, whatever sweets, whatever chocolate bar plastered up on that, or, finger licking good, KFC, McDonald's, whatever other slogans they have plastered up on that. So like you can't do that. And then even when you walk into a store, it's like the way they have it set up is like, tries to get you to eat these different foods. All these kind of things, you can't control the food promotion system is basically what I'm saying. You also can't control, to a large extent, unless you move, obviously, your access to food, like we've discussed, food swamps, food deserts, all that kind of stuff. Like, again, it's a hard thing to navigate. You can't change social psychology. Like, yeah, okay, you could say like you need to get rid of all your friends because they're dead weight, they're just holding you back. But again, that's not usually a realistic way to navigate things. And you obviously can't change like societal structures to a large extent. Like obviously you can by voting and doing whatever else, but like by voting, changing your vote, you're not going to change the fact that Irish mothers are feeders. Like that's not going to change that. So like a lot of societal structures, you're just not going to change.
Yep.
Right. And then just to end this podcast, I basically just want to throw out a few things just to get the gears turning in your head for future episodes. Like that's basically what this whole episode has been, to like get the gears turning in your head and thinking about this stuff a little bit more. But I want you to start thinking about solutions to the things that we've discussed, because while it's well and good to figure out all of the different inputs that lead to this situation, like we ultimately want to look at how do we guide policy, how do we guide our individual choices, etc., to a position where society is back on track in terms of our obesity risk, etc. Right? So one of the solutions which is often put out is like changing the free market, getting more government intervention or more regulation. That's seen as a solution, right? But again, people would counter that and say, how do we stop the tyrannical state from making poor decisions or becoming ever more tyrannical, like big government is bad, etc. Right? That's again counter. We have to navigate that situation. Like where's the solution there? Right? And like who's to say the government will get it right when they've gotten taxes and subsidies and whatever else wrong multiple times before, right? So again, it's not like they're infallible and they get the right decision all the time, right? And again, we obviously especially don't want these decisions, if we're going to regulate the free market, we don't want these decisions to negatively impact the poor more, right? Like we basically don't want this to be a tax on the poor, because we're saying that people in this lower socioeconomic status are disproportionately affected by the obesity obesogenic environment that we find ourselves in, right? So again, it's a hard thing to navigate. And I just want you to be thinking about, if you were in government, what would you do? Just that's what I want you to kind of be thinking about going forward with these discussions, right? And then you also have to look into that in terms of what you do and how you change the food environment. Does that end up making food cost more, right? Just in general. And is that something that you would be willing to vote for, right? If you were to be like, right, we're going to make the food supply more expensive to solve the obesity epidemic. First of all, that's going to be a tax on the poor, but would you be willing to pay more for your food? Or would that incentivize you to eat less food, right? Again, I just want you to be thinking about this kind of stuff, right? Maybe you just go, it's a tax on lower quality food that we have, like it's like McDonald's gets taxed or something like that, right? Again, I just want you to be thinking of what would you do if you were in government, right? And now I know a large contingent, no, I should say a portion of our viewership would be like less regulation is the answer, right? And I'm definitely economically right. So, in a lot of circumstances, I would be definitely in favor of less regulation. However, people are not making good decisions on their own, right? And like less regulation in the advertising space, like that's probably not going to result in better diets, right? So if you are in favor of less regulation, like what would that actually look like, right? Is it just a question of more personal accountability? Like you could argue that, well, people aren't being personally accountable to their actions, so that's the issue that we need to resolve. And again, if that's what you think and that's the solution you're going to propose, like how do you actually propose to implement that and then also like enforce it effectively, right? Is it a case that you would say the solution is more education, more early education on good food choices, teaching people to cook, all those soft skills, etc.? Like, is that how you're going to deal with it? If you were in the government, is that what you would do, right? If you were in the government, maybe you would say personal training and activity coaching, are going to be part of the healthcare system, and maybe that's something that we would support because obviously we think that that's a good thing. But also maybe it's not a good thing because, governments are inefficient and who's to say they would get that right again, just playing devil's advocate here, right? Maybe it's a case of, we just want to give cognitive behavioral therapy to everyone. We're just going to deal with everyone. We're going to really subsidize and, prioritize psychology and psychological interventions in terms of helping people with the emotional side of things. Because again, you see people arguing for that as well, right? And maybe that's the case. Are you going to change culture somehow? Like again, like how do you change this kind of feeder culture that we have, or the fact that, you know, if we want to interact and socialize with other humans, we have to drink or eat. Like if you're going to, what's your intervention there? Maybe you want to intervene and, you know, give mandatory stomach parasites to people who are over a BMI of 25. You know, is that your intervention, right? Because again, like you see these things put out every so often, right? Is surgery, is that the solution that you think is going to be the case for the obesity epidemic? Maybe it's the case that you, as a government or policymaker or whatever, you heavily subsidize like bariatric surgeries, and that's how you're going to solve it, right? Again, I want you to think that through. Is it the case that you want to give people drugs to help with weight management? And I don't mean like tren or anything. I mean like metformin or something, where you're like, okay, this has interactions that are potentially beneficial in this population. Maybe we like heavily subsidize these drugs, right? And then a final one, like, do we go back to the church? Do we start paying indulgences for the sins of sloth and gluttony? Is that how we deal with the situation? Or again, go back to the church and, you know, have a better sense of community, have a better sense of, you know, where you fit in society, etc. Like, is that the solution, right? Do you have any other solutions that you would like to people to ponder on? And before we wrap this up, Gary?
Yeah, no, just to kind of steel man the position related to the kind of regulation component, like a lot of, because this is something that obviously like immediately comes to mind. Like you say, I know you're just posing the question, but people often assume that like if people propose policy of taxation on certain foods, that like that's inherently regressive because you're basically just making the poor pay more. But the ideal there is that you put an incentive in place for food corporations to reformulate products in favor of being in line with the healthy recommendations. So I think that is something that's important for people to get, because well, like we had a presentation in college a few weeks ago, and one of the people watching the presentation was Professor Ivan Perry, and he's very much he's a titan of public health, and someone made that point about it being regressive, and he was just like, no, this is not. He's like, I've been listening to this for 30 years. No way. So it is just worth thinking about that. Like one way, like if you think about the sugar tax, for example, the ideal there is not necessarily that everyone keeps drinking the same amount of sugar sweetened beverages, or that you just stop people solely because it's more expensive, but that Coca-Cola turn around and say, you know what, we've actually found a way to maintain the product being tasty and useful for the consumer, but we've reduced sugar content by 30%. Similarly, like it might be the case that I think this is probably less likely, but if you were to say, right, if you're going to sell a burger in a McDonald's chain in Ireland, it needs to have less than, I don't know, 5 grams of saturated fat, and it needs to have more than 4 grams of fiber. And as a result, it would just be a case of McDonald's slightly changing the wheat flour that they use while preserving most of the product. So they're the types of things that I think people would generally be in favor of when it does come to regulation. And I think some of those are very reasonable, because I think that another thing that's just worth getting out of this conversation as well is that it's not just about totally changing everything to this radically perfect environment where we don't sell any junk foods, but rather that there's just an environment that's slightly more conducive of you making better decisions. So like, for example, if it was the double cheeseburger in McDonald's, that maybe it has just 10% less calories and just 10% more fiber, so that over decades, those things actually start to add up, and over millions of people, that you actually see a dent on public health as a result. So anytime we're kind of posing these solutions, like I'm not in favor of like the government just deciding exactly what we can and can't eat. Like you go into your Centra and you've just got like 10 options or something. Like I don't think that would be a great outcome either.
Fucking social credit score. I'd be like, Gary,
yeah,
you've had 6 chocolate bars this month. And yeah, like that's the thing with government intervention. Like you always have to keep in mind the unintended consequences of those actions, because again, government is inherently inefficient because it doesn't have to abide by free market economics. And again, that's the beauty in it, right? I always look at it in terms of it's basically like warfare. Like you want to give your enemy a way out, right? Like you don't just cut them off because like then they fight to the death because you've only given the other option of death, right? So you do it with these companies where it's like, here's your way out. Reformulation is your way out, or whatever it is that you're trying to nudge them towards in terms of this is what we're trying to regulate against in terms of higher calorie stuff. So you give them the way out. You give them like the sugar tax is a good one in terms of like I wouldn't be for taxation in general, but it's a good one in terms of a proof of concept where it's like you give them a way out. The way out was a reformulation. It wasn't just we're putting a tax on any drinks that contain sugar, you know? It was a tax on when they contain over this amount of sugar, etc. So it gave them a way out where it's like, oh, we only have to abide by this level. So we just reformulate so we stay underneath that level and happy days. We avoid the tax, you know? So it can be done well. Again, this is why they need to be very well thought out. And unfortunately, governments are very rarely well thought out, and that leads to a lot of mistrust or distrust in the effectiveness of government policy. And it's actually, as I was just discussing with Gary earlier on, like the more you learn about economics, the worse you view governments in terms of their interventions. And this is not just a left-right thing. And this is just on both sides. They would look at it and be like, this is just like from a basic economics point of view, it's like, these guys just don't know what the fuck they're doing. Like anyone, you know, like a left-wing government gets in or a right-wing government gets in, and none of them seem to care about the unintended consequences of their actions. But anyway, that's for a future episode, I'm sure. Anyway, Gary, where can people find us? Do all that jazz. This is a long one. What else do you have to say?
Yeah, too long. It doesn't matter. No one's listening anymore other than me or you for listening back to listen to the poor sound quality because it's Sunday evening. But anyway, yeah, you can find us obviously on all of our social media platforms if you just want to follow along with the content that we're producing for free. Subscribe to the Triage newsletter, recommended. Join the Triage Method Community Facebook group and follow along on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter if you want. And obviously, if you're a coach and you're looking to further your education, you can join the Coach's Corner. So that's highly recommended. And if you're someone who's just looking to get on the path with your own goals, then I'd recommend getting involved with online coaching. So particularly as we move into the new year, which will hopefully be a better year for most of us, you can get on the path with your goals by signing up for online coaching. So we do have spaces available if you are interested.
Absolutely wonderful. Anyway, guys, I've literally nothing else to say. So peace out.